Have you ever had such high expectations for anything that you react to it, even when it's not happening at all or something entirely different? Imagine then that you are approaching an aeroplane and that you have just read about 5G interference when your plane suddenly begins to spin. Keep an eye out. An Air France crew of 2 pilots and 13 cabin crew members were planned to make 2 flights on April 3, 2022, from Paris Charles de Gaulle Airport to New York and back the next day. Given the scheduled departure times of the planes, the Air France crew found this specific responsibility to be quite difficult. At 14.45 Central European Time, which wasn't too horrible, they reported for duty. At 16.30, when everything was finished and everyone was seated, the plane was shut off for New York. Since the crew became accustomed to this time zone, I will now use Central European times throughout the video. Since the flight lasted roughly 7 hours and 5 minutes, they arrived in New York at 23.55 and were shut off at 3 minutes after midnight. The cabin staff was not in bed until well after 2 in the morning, since they had to disembark every passenger while the pilots finished their paperwork and then had to go to the hotel. After that, there was a 20-hour or so rest period till 23.00 the next day. The 2 pilots engaged were able to get a good night's sleep, and after roughly 7 hours, they woke up alone. After spending a day in New York, they went back to their hotel in the evening to recuperate briefly before the most taxing aspect of their duty, the return flight, came around. For about an hour and a half, the entire team was picked up at midnight. After a half-hour journey to the airport, they had to begin getting ready for the return trip, which was set to take off at 3 in the morning. This would imply that after flying for a significant amount of the night, they would return to Paris at roughly 10:20 a.m. The crews assigned to these night flights were given a lengthy rest break, both before and after the missions, because Air France understood how taxing these trips were. Although the 2 pilots who would be working together had never flown together before, they got along well during their first portion of the assignment. With just under 11,700 hours of overall experience, the 53-year-old captain had operated as a captain on the 777 for almost 1,200 of those hours. He has previously flown the Airbus A320 as a captain. With just under 5,200 hours of total service, 869 of which were spent flying on the 777, the first officer was also highly experienced. The fact that both pilots had a great deal of Airbus expertise may have had a minor role in what was about to happen. He had also flown on the Airbus A320 till roughly 3 years before this incident. It's also important to note that on February 8, approximately 2 months prior to this flight, the French aviation authorities released a general safety information publication regarding the potential risks of 5G signals interfering with radio altimeters installed on specific aircraft, including the Boeing 777. In Europe, 5G networks actually operated on a lower frequency range, which was farther away from the radar altimeters and hence not really an issue there. Perhaps you recall this entire fiasco, as it became a major controversy in the United States. However, it's possible that the authorities did not convey that information very well. All of this meant, however, that pilots were discussing what this kind of interference might cause a lot, and we know that the 2 pilots controlling this specific flight had also been reading up on the topic. We now arrive at Paris Charles de Gaulle for the flight home from New York. When the pilots arrived in the crew room early on April 5th, they began by reviewing the weather, flight plans, and NOTAMs for their next flight, as pilots always do. With some light breezes and a pretty stable warm air mass that produced some covering clouds that reached as low as 300 feet, the weather appeared to be great on the way and upon arrival in Charles de Gaulle. Given that the clouds will obscure 2/3 of the Eiffel Tower, that may not be ideal weather for tourists, but for a seasoned airline crew, it wasn't a major issue. After ensuring that they were satisfied with their pre-flight, the pilots briefed their cabin crew before making their way to the aircraft. The flight was scheduled to carry 177 passengers, and as soon as the security checks were finished, boarding began and proceeded smoothly. After deciding that the first officer would be pilot flying for the flight, the captain went over the technical log and finished the walk-around while he was preparing the cockpit. A 17-year-old Boeing 700 and 777-300ER that had been with their front since it was new was the plane they were supposed to fly. Unlike the Boeing 737 I fly, this amazing airliner has full fly-by-wire flight controls, which means that the pilots or autopilot's control inputs are fed into computers. It is powered by two massive GE 9100 and 15 Bravo turbofan engines, which subsequently transmit those digital commands to the aircraft controls themselves. All you need to know right now is that there were no known issues with this specific aircraft, but I will shortly delve more into these systems because they will be important to this story. There were no operational limitations, and all systems had been operating flawlessly the night before. The first officer gave the captain a briefing regarding the departure they had ahead of them when he returned to the cockpit after finishing his walk-around. After finishing the pre-start processes, Afran's aircraft 011 began pushing back from the gate for its flight over towards Paris at roughly 3 in the morning, again European time. At time 03.16, the first officer punched the toga buttons, causing the thrust levels to advance into takeoff thrusts. The taxi ride was entirely uneventful. After a perfectly normal takeoff, the plane was shortly let out over the Atlantic Ocean and reached its cruise altitude. Since the trip occurred early in the morning, the pilot quickly made the decision to take advantage of what is known as regulated rest, which is precisely what it sounds like. It lets one pilot sleep while the other stays up and manages the radio and controls. When working during circadian low, this is a wonderful approach to prevent weariness. As you might assume, there are a number of restrictions associated with this procedure to ensure its complete safety. Different companies have slightly different protocols for doing controlled rest, but generally speaking, they involve alerting the cabin crew, only doing it while on cruise, and ensuring that there is adequate time between the last pilot waking up and the time to begin descending to prevent sleep inertia. At this point, there is no indication that the pilot's actions and their excellent sleep during the night stay in New York had anything to do with weariness. As Air France Flight 011 approached its peak of descent at around 7 in the morning, the first officer turned over the controls to the captain and began preparing and briefing for the anticipated arrival. They also received the most recent weather, which showed roughly 3,000 meters of visibility and an overcast cloud layer that extended down to about 300 feet. Although there was no recorded or predicted turbulence, there were some reports of light precipitation in the vicinity along with westerly winds of about 8 knots. As they had been intending at the outset, this meant they could execute a routine Category 1 ILS approach into runway 26 liters. The captain was given a briefing by the first officer on how he planned to fly the approach. He explained that since it would be flown in instrument meteorological conditions, INC, which means inside clouds, they would need to stabilize completely before reaching 1,000 feet. As a result, they would need to set up their gear and flaps a little sooner than they would on a day with favorable weather. But other than that, there wasn't much more to cover. The crew began going over the descent checklist once the first officer returned control of the controls after the briefing was over. An electronic checklist, which is normally shown on the lower multifunctional display, is now used to accomplish this on the 777. Although some checklist items, like the approach briefing, must be manually checked off by the pilots, this is a fairly neat little function that the aircraft itself manages and checks off. I personally adore this system because, in contrast to the 737 I fly, which has very little reminders, if the pilots forget to complete something on the checklist, the system will alert them with an ACAS warning well before landing. In any case, everything still appeared to be perfectly normal as the plane soon began its slow descent towards Paris. The cabin crew began preparing the cabin for the landing as soon as the captain announced to the passengers that the landing would be on time and that the weather below would be fine, but not ideal. Nothing unusual appeared to be happening in the cockpit, but it's possible that the first officer was considering the information he had lately read regarding 5G antenna interference. It's important to keep in mind that he had heard that Toga's failure to participate during a go-around was one indication of that kind of meddling. In any case, the aircraft began receiving its final vectors down into the ILS at approximately 7:45, when it was in contact with the Paris approach. To really understand what is about to happen, you must be aware of a few technical aspects of the Boeing 777 before we move on to the action portion of the story. Although I stated at the beginning of the movie that this is a fully fly-by-wire aircraft, the pilots generally don't feel that way. By ensuring that the outer throttle and control yokes are moving both when the other pilot is flying and when the outer pilot is directing the aircraft, Boeing has made a purposeful effort to keep the pilots at the center of the operation. As a result, the controls feel and look just like those on older Boeing aircraft, and they provide excellent visual clues about what is happening, which improves the pilot's situational awareness. However, it also means that there isn't a dual input alert, which would be present on an Airbus if both pilots began entering data on the yokes simultaneously. Since the flying pilot would be able to tell if the other pilot started making inputs out of the blue, that was never actually considered necessary. In reality, the flight control system functions by means of a couple of position transducers that translate the inputs from the yoke of the pilot or autopilot into analog electrical impulses, which are subsequently transmitted to 4 actuator control electronic processors, or ACES. The 3 main flight computers, or PFS, receive the digitally converted signals from these computers and use them to compute the directives for the control surface. Following the decision of these directives, which are based on the aircraft's flight envelope protection and control laws, the rectified signals are returned to the ACS, which transforms them back into analog signals for the power control unit. The flying controls are actually positioned by PCUs and stabilizer trim control modules. Perhaps now you see what I mean when I say that aviation is all about acronyms and abbreviations like these. In any case, this implies that the Boeing 777, like the Airbus, has envelope protections that are intended to assist pilots in avoiding any maneuvers that would endanger or overstress the aircraft. However, once more, pilots have the final say in Boeing, so the systems won't stop them from going beyond those safeguards. However, the control yokes are currently not connected to one another in an electronic manner. Rather, they are mechanically connected by means of 2 distinct systems. Well, 3, but I'll concentrate on the control columns and yokes here rather than the pedals. Pilots can adjust the pitch control by pushing or pulling on the yokes, which will move the control columns that the yokes are attached to. 2 torque tubes that are connected by a breakout mechanism are used to connect those control columns beneath the floor. That device is in place to ensure that, in the event that the other control column jams for any reason, at least one pilot will still be able to operate the aircraft. Additionally, the pilots had never been given any other explanation for the system's existence than that it could jam. The way this breakout mechanism operates is by connecting the left-hand torque tube to a roller that can roll on a cam. I realize this is a little nerdy. After that, the cam is attached to the torque tube on the right, and 2 springs are attached to the torque tube on the left. These springs are tensioned so that the roller always returns to the cam recess. The 2 tubes will remain completely synchronized as long as that roller is in place. But if a force greater than about 25 pounds or 11 kilograms is applied to those springs, the columns will desynchronize, allowing the aircraft to be controlled by the free control column. It's also important to keep in mind that in the event of a desynchronization, the primary flight computers will determine which pitch control inputs to employ based on the arithmetic mean value of the 2 column locations. Now, a somewhat more complex but comparable mechanism is fitted along the roll axis. When pilots turn the yoke, cables inside the control column move, activating the wheel position transducers, which relay those data to the AC. This allows the aircraft to roll. A wheel drum, which is positioned on a movable shaft on either side of the cockpit beneath the floor, is then used to run these cables. Two force limiters, which are normally rigid, are then used to connect those shafts to one another. This allows the yoke movements to be synchronized. However, whenever they experience a force larger than 25 pounds or 11 kilograms, they are also made to compress or expand. If the combined force exceeds 50 pounds or 22 kilograms, the two yokes will likewise desynchronize. The PFCs will utilize the arithmetic mean value from the two yokes to determine how to steer the aircraft if that occurs, or if one pilot applies that force to a single yoke, or if the two pilots push in different directions. As I mentioned before, this will be a little nerdy, but that's essentially what we do on our channel. If you enjoy it, please subscribe and like it. We truly appreciate it. In any case, how is this narrative related to all of this? Well, it will soon become extremely clear. As the aircraft began approaching the localizer at approximately 7:45, the first officer began requesting that flaps be increased. After being cleared for the ILS approach by the responsible air traffic controller, the captain began going over the landing checklist while the first officer activated the approach mode. Everything appeared to be going quite well thus far. After setting down the cabin crew, the pilot proceeded with the aircraft's configuration, and by 7:49, the aircraft was completely stabilized and all checklists had been finished. They had just been turned over to the tower controller, Charles de Gaulle, who had given the all-clear to land. However, for separation purposes, he had also instructed them to limit their speed to 180 knots to 6 nautical miles. This is a very common request to reach a major airport, and the pilots were not bothered by it. So far, everything was going smoothly. The first officer maintained both the autothrottle and the flight directors engaged, but he removed the autopilot to hand fly the remainder of the approach once the aircraft had reached 1670 feet, 1 minute later. I can totally understand why he wanted to disconnect early here, because the weather wasn't ideal. But it wasn't bad either, and long-haul pilots only make a small number of landings each month. In order to keep well inside Air France's stabilized criterion of 1 dot displacement in either direction, he now meticulously followed the flight director's instructions. After he disconnected, the largest variation was actually less than 0.1 dots from the localizer and 0.25 dots from the glide slope, which is actually quite smooth flying. However, at this point, while the plane was descending at a height of about 1,300 feet, the first officer seemed to be experiencing an odd sensation. At one point, he had spotted a little bank angle had begun to form when he peered down on his primary flying display. Even though it was barely 0.5 degrees to the right, he felt as though he had no real responsibility for it, which brought back memories of those 5G signals. Is there any chance that interference is occurring here? He started alternating the roll control inputs to both sides, with a little more focus on the left, while he was chatting with the captain about how odd the banking angle was. The plane, which was completely trouble-free and unaffected by any turbulence or severe winds at the time, just did as the first officer instructed and began turning left. Following the first officer's comment, the captain glanced down at his primary flight monitor and was taken aback to find that an abrupt deviation was beginning to form. Although he had previously observed some tiny roll inputs, he had concluded that this might be due to wake turbulence from the aircraft in front of them, or perhaps some slight over-control on the part of his colleague. He yelled, "Check the runway," which essentially meant that the first officer had to keep following the localizer because it had begun to veer slightly to the left. In order to combat what he perceived to be the aircraft's propensity to drift to the right, the first officer began increasing the left bank more and more at this point. It is important to emphasize that the aeroplane was in perfect condition at this time. No outside forces, including winds, technical difficulties, or interference, were detected by the flight recorders. This indicates that the first officer's manual inputs were the only factors influencing the aircraft's fly path at this precise moment. When the plane crossed 1,117 feet, or around 2.1 nautical miles, from the runway, he abruptly and unexpectedly performed a go-around because he was now certain that something was amiss. The aircraft was in a 6-degree bank to the left, with both control wheels deflected 17 degrees to the left, indicating that the aircraft was now increasing its left-hand bank as he hit the toga buttons and yelled, go around flaps." Because the aircraft was in an increasing left bank and the first officer had initiated a go-around, which is something we would never do, the captain thought that things could quickly go ugly. The first officer began pitching up much more quickly than usual, nearly 3 times faster than we often do during a go-around, possibly as a result of this odd maneuver. Of course, it's also possible that he overreacted significantly due to the stress of the situation, or that he applied more force than he typically would have due to imagined flight control concerns. To follow through and feel what his colleague was doing, the skipper placed his left hand on the control yoke. It's crucial to understand a few things about how Boeing aeroplanes are typically flown in order to comprehend why the actual issues with this flight begin at this point. There should never be more than one pilot operating and controlling the aircraft. However, in practice, or occasionally when both pilots do so, this isn't always the case. As a training captain, I must admit that there have been occasions when I have, for instance, been teaching a new cadet. In particular, during the takeoff rotational landings, I have subtly placed my hand behind the yoke to slow down an excessively rapid movement. Because the Boeing 727-800 is a very long aeroplane and a tail hit might easily result from an excessively quick or abrupt turn. This can be quite important, especially during rotations. The cadet would only detect a seeming minor increase in the force required on his or her controls to continue drawing back if I had to step in. In an ideal world, this kind of information would be pre-briefed. However, there are many instances where a cadet has performed a series of excellent rotations and landings before making a quick one that needs to be halted. During these crucial maneuvers, all of the captains I know carefully guard the controls, especially when they are flying with first officers they don't know well. This was precisely what began to occur, which is why I am telling you this. The captain began to input controls in the opposite direction, probably in an attempt to slow down the maneuver, while the first officer continued to rotate more quickly than usual up towards the go-around attitude. Such an input would have produced a dual input warning on the Airbus, which both pilots were accustomed to, as I mentioned earlier in the film. However, since the two controls of the 777 are coupled, there was no such warning in this instance. Since this first officer was an experienced pilot and already believed that he was dealing with some sort of flight control issue, the resistance he was now experiencing probably only strengthened that diagnosis. If a new cadet had been flying here, they would have been accustomed to a training captain assisting them in the event of an error. This is the reason that maintaining areas of responsibility and maintaining constant communication are crucial. The pitch-up was already at 11 degrees, and the roll had grown to 27 degrees 1 second after the go-around had begun. Even though the captain was now pushing forward with considerable force, he failed to alert the first officer, who responded by tugging on his yoke even more forcefully. The two controls became desynchronized in pitch as a result of the combined power of these opposing inputs being strong enough to trigger the control column breakout mechanism I previously discussed. As a result, the aeroplane began pitching based on the average input of the two control columns, which would have been extremely odd for the two pilots to see and experience. Imagine just seeing a very slight pitch-up response from the aeroplane when you pull back as hard as you can while holding the control column in your gut. The pilots now undoubtedly believed that they had flight control issues, even if they didn't previously. When making these inputs with his left hand, the captain clearly felt that the roll control was extremely rigid. He believed that the first officer might be experiencing some sort of flight control jam, so he attempted to assist him by pushing forward and entering the right aileron. However, he also noticed that the pitch controls were quite rigid when he did so, which naturally makes perfect sense, given that the first officer was still entering the opposite data. The captain understood that he had not noticed Alnav and Toga being enunciated on the flight mode enunciation because the first officer was straining to manage the aircraft while using both hands on the yoke. He then grabbed the thrust levers and gave Toga a second, third, and fourth shove. The first officer's first Toga push actually caused Alnav and Toga to activate within a second. Must realize how quickly all of these preliminary activities occurred. The roll breakout mechanism also triggered since the pilots were now battling each other in pitch and roll. This resulted in the roll controls becoming desynchronized and averaging out for a brief period of time. The aircraft's pitch continued to rise in spite of the captain's inputs, reaching its maximum pitch up of 24 degrees 12 seconds after the go-around began. That may not seem like much, but a typical go-around only requires about 15 degrees of pitch, and neither the flaps nor the gear had been retracted as required by protocol. Along with the high pitch, this resulted in a lot of additional drag, which caused the speed to start dropping. When this was detected, an unknown person pushed the thrust levers to their maximum. The outer throttle will force the thrust levers into what is known as decreased go-around thrust at the first push of Toga. This is usually between 90% and 1, and it will provide a pleasant, calm ascent rate of at least 2,000 feet per minute. Max thrust is activated by a second push of the Toga buttons, which the captain had done by pressing the buttons repeatedly. However, the outside throttle probably didn't have enough time to react, so someone manually pushed it up. Because of a known software bug that occasionally resets the electronic checklist when an approach is abruptly abandoned, the first officer realized that the configuration was incorrect at 07, 51, and 25 seconds. He then called out "Go around positive climb" and retracted the landing gear himself. But because the flaps were still in the landing configuration, a configuration warning began to blare in the cockpit, adding to the stress. If that wasn't enough, a master caution warning and an ACAS checklist incomplete norm were also displayed. However, whatever the cause of that signal, there were now numerous warnings in this cockpit, all of which were essentially self-induced. Retraction of the gear and flaps at the pilot's flying direction is the responsibility of the pilot monitoring, in this instance the captain. However, at this point, very few of the conventional operating procedures were working well in this cockpit, which may appear absolutely ridiculous to those of you watching. Why couldn't they realize that they were engaged in combat? This most likely resulted from their shared perception of having problems with flight control. The scene was set by the first officer, who expressed his opinion that the aircraft was acting strangely. As the go-round began, they both believed they were assisting one another in resolving this odd jam, but in fact, they were the ones causing all of these problems. In any case, the captain began regaining some initiative 2 seconds after the gear was retracted. He called out push in an attempt to lower the aircraft's nose. This did have the desired effect. The control synchronized once more as soon as the first officer ceased tugging. The issue was that the captain continued to push ahead, which caused the pitch to start rapidly lowering. Since he had not yet officially taken control of the aircraft, he was expecting the first officer to bring the pitch under control, so when it fell below the set target, he quickly screamed out "Stop! Stop!" The first officer began tugging once more upon hearing the captain's call, indicating that they were now opposing each other's inputs once more. However, the force was insufficient this time to cause the desynchronization. The first officer identified the flawed flap arrangement 10 seconds later, while they were still battling this self-inflicted flight control issue. The first officer retracted the flaps to the proper position after the captain yelled, "Oh, flaps," 20 seconds later. Once more, the pilots were now performing each other's jobs in the wrong order, but at least the configuration warning was quiet. When the captain finally yelled, "I have controls," at seconds 0, 7, 52, And 5. The entire situation was essentially over. The pilot hadn't even figured out what was happening for the entire 53 seconds that the conflicting inputs and resulting fight had lasted. Though the captain still stated that he still felt the flying controls seemed a little stiff, everything returned to normal as soon as the first officer stopped making inputs once the captain formally took over the controls. After reporting to air traffic control, the pilots proceeded to ascend to the go-around height. Once they had confirmed that the flight controls were functioning correctly, the captain returned the controls to the first officer and engaged the autopilot once more. The FORDEC decision-making model, which stands for facts, options, risk-benefits, decide, execute, and check, was implemented in order to try to determine what had truly happened. This is a variant of the PIOC concept, which is used by my airline and is designed to provide pilots with an organized method of handling issues while they are under pressure. This is an excellent method of working, and I strongly advise anyone in any industry to adopt it. I also cover it in great detail in my leadership classes. They began by debating whether or not the controls had been jammed in this instance, and they both concluded that this was probably not the case. After that, they talked about the potential for 5G interference. The toga's lack of engagement was one of the signs, which they both believed had occurred even though it hadn't. Orally, the first officers recommended that they divert to Paris to ensure that whatever caused this wouldn't happen to them again. However, the captain believed that staying in Charles de Gaulle and flying the next approach into runway 27 right instead would maximize their fuel supply. After giving it some thought, the first officer concluded that it was definitely a good idea. They then shared this information with our traffic control, who decided to begin vectoring the aircraft in for an approach to this new runway. After landing successfully on runway 27 right, Air France aircraft 011 taxied into the gate around 10 minutes later. In light of what had transpired, the captain took care to save the data from the cockpit voice recorder, which was essential for the inquiry that followed. I have read far too many accounts of cockpit voice recorders being overwritten, so I can't stress enough how crucial it is to make sure that this is done. If this has happened to you as a pilot, make sure that you pull the CBR circuit breaker. Thankfully, a new rule is currently in effect that will considerably increase the amount of voice recording time that is accessible. In this instance, the pilots accidentally pressed the transmit button during the event, broadcasting their battle over the radio frequency. As a result, it was picked up by multiple social media platforms almost instantly, garnering significant media attention. In the end, the investigation revealed that the entire disaster was self-inflicted and that the crews of the Air France 777 were generally unaware of how the control breakaway mechanisms worked. The notion that opposing pilot inputs, rather than only control yams, may create breakouts was not well understood. As a result, Air France requested additional information from Boeing concerning these functions so that its pilots could be informed. Curiously, this analysis also revealed that, despite the fact that multiple inputs were believed to be primarily an Airbus problem, they occurred on the Boeing fleet nearly as frequently, at a rate of 0.4 occurrences per 1,000 flights. This leads me to maybe the most significant conclusion that can be drawn from this occurrence. Regardless of the style of flying, it is crucial for all pilots to be extremely clear about who is in control at any one time and to communicate clearly if that role needs to change. Respect the areas of duty at all times, since failure to do so may result in misunderstandings like this one that might have far more dire consequences. Following this event, Boeing modified several parts of their flight crew training handbook to clarify the operation of the breakout mechanisms, and Air France introduced additional training modules for their pilots to ensure that this does not happen again. Thanks for watching. If you found this video helpful, please like and subscribe. Stay safe, and see you in the next one.